Well, we've talked about Server Core as the default installation option for Windows Server 2016. It is a great choice for domain controllers and infrastructure servers. And so while I only have machines set up with the desktop experience, it's very likely for you to install on Server Core. Okay. You still have two installation methods. I mean, technically it's the same two you have with the desktop experience. You can do it remotely using Server Manager. I mean, you just can't do it locally, but you can configure remote management, add the server in, and then right-click, add roles and features, and then promote the machine with a wizard. I think that's how most do it, although you could just write a little PowerShell command. They are fairly simple commands in order to do it locally. So we see an example there: install ADDS domain controller, install DNS, credential. We're providing a credential to it. We'll be prompted for the password and the domain name. Now, in that case, you would actually be joining, or you would be creating a replica domain controller in an existing domain. If you are installing a brand new domain, it's install ADDS domain. Sometimes that might not be available until you run the import module command with the ADDS deployment module name. All right, but then other than that, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. It is actually pretty easy to do it via PowerShell as well. As I mentioned earlier, we're often going to find ourselves, in almost every case, in an environment that already has Active Directory. Okay, so the question then becomes, do we upgrade the domain controllers or do we just add new domain controllers? And often it's new domain controllers. We're introducing them into the forest, and then the old systems are systematically demoted. When you do this, it will require a preparation of the domain and of the schema. This is done using the adprep.exe utility, which exists in the setup media. So adprep, forest prep, domain prep will handle that. It's a slight schema update. It's adding a couple of things in the domain partition. It's all done behind the scenes. You just have to run the command. Once you run the command, then you can add 2016 domain controllers into the environment. It's also possible to upgrade Server 2008 and later to 2016. We talked about that earlier. It retains files and settings, but it also automatically upgrades your domain controllers. So if you've got domain controllers running an older version of the operating system that you want to upgrade, it is very easy to just upgrade them one at a time. And especially in light of the fact that these domain controllers are often running in virtual machines, we don't even have the whole hardware, restriction that we talked about. Remember, we were talking that these days, I mean, the hardware that's on these servers, you may very well be dealing with just a 1 to 2 year old server. And I failed to mention at that point, you might be dealing with a virtual server. If you're dealing with a virtual server, an actual VM, well, then the hardware is irrelevant because if I need to put more hardware on there, I'll just expand the hardware capabilities. So at that point, it becomes much easier to just upgrade existing domain controllers in order to implement the newest version. When we add a domain controller to an existing environment, it's not starting out with just a fresh database. Even in our instance where we created a separate tree in the existing forest, it still replicated some of the information. In situations where you're adding replica domain controllers, it's even more. It's all of the information that's being replicated: domain, config, and schema partitions. Well, in some cases, you might want to deviate from the norm, and the norm is just simply find a source domain controller and replicate it. If the source domain controllers are in different physical locations, if the WAN links that separate these domain controllers don't have a whole lot of available bandwidth, then I can use what's called the install from media option, or IFM. IFM allows you, or IFM is multiple steps, I should say. It starts with the ntds util command. The ntds util command can be used to create snapshots of the Active Directory database. It creates essentially a point in time snapshot, like a restore point. You copy that snapshot into a folder on the destination server. Optionally, you could be using removable media of some sort. Remember, they're not very big. And then when you run the installation wizard, you just choose the install from media option in that wizard. You specify where your source domain controller is going to be. I either skipped right by this, or in actuality, I don't think when we're setting up a new root domain, it's even there. And the reason it's not there is because the schema and the config partitions are so inconsequential that you would never need it. So it's only when you're setting up a replica domain controller that you would need to do this. In addition to that, domain controllers operating in a virtual machine environment support automatic cloning, and that is going to provide you with even more rapid domain controller deployment, and is particularly relevant in these host and compute environments, which are often even evolving into private cloud environments where domain controllers have to be deployed on the fly to support certain applications and services. So let's talk about some of the benefits of cloning, and then we'll go through the actual process. Rapid deployment is one, okay? But cloning a domain controller is sort of like imaging a machine. Only cloning a domain controller is going to create a copy, a snapshot of this domain controller, and then allow me to create other virtual machines that use that snapshot. And so it's even going to be higher speed than imaging, and it's certainly going to take a lot less planning. It's going to also be used for a recovery strategy. So we create a clone of a domain controller, and we do so on a periodic basis, and it serves sort of as a backup. And then, as I said, it's definitely used in private cloud scenarios. Private cloud scenarios where users can make a request for a particular application or service. Well, often behind the scenes, that might require a domain controller to support it, and so that they can be rapidly deployed that way. There are a few steps to deploying or to cloning a domain controller. The first step is to add the domain controller into the clonable domain controllers group. This is a new group started in Server 2012. It's a built-in group in Active Directory, and you just simply go and take the computer account and place it into that group. Okay, then we're going to be verifying app and service compatibility. That's going to be done through a PowerShell command. This is all much easier to just kind of walk through the process, which we will very shortly. We'll create a DC clone config XML file. Yet again, that is done through PowerShell after you've decided if there are applications or services that you want to exclude. And that clone config file just gets placed in the appropriate location within the virtual machine. This sort of functions almost as a sysprep. Okay, now if you ran sysprep on a domain controller, it would be bad news. Right? If you run sysprep on a regular machine, a member server, it removes its connection to the domain, it changes the server name, and that's the same thing that would happen on a domain controller. So you can't just prepare a domain controller, run sysprep, and then use that as an image. Doesn't work. But the DC clone config gives that sort of option. Basically, once I've created that config file, I'm going to shut down the VM, and then I'm going to export it once. I'm just exporting the files over to another location, and I can use those exported files to create as many clones as necessary. Once those clones have been created, this is all done in Hyper-V, then I can start the clones up. Okay, and so that's the process for cloning domain controllers, and it is particularly relevant because it's heavily used in private cloud environments. All right, so now we're back at our system that we just upgraded. We'll use this to just verify things. DSA.MSC is one of the ways to get into the Active Directory users and computers snap-in, and we can see that this is fabric.local, and in the domain controllers OU we have Lund server 1. Okay, now I actually logged in as the same domain or the same user account because it's the enterprise admin account, so it exists actually in or can be used to log in either domain. The prerequisite, of course, for cloning, which I think I mentioned just in a roundabout way, is that it is a virtual machine. So you don't clone physical domain controllers, you only clone virtualized domain controllers. So the first step here would be to go into our users container, and I've got a clonable domain controllers group. I'm just going to double click this, hit the members, click add, and then choose our Lund SVR1. It's odd that it didn't find that. Oh, make sure the object types has computers because it doesn't by default. There we go. All right, so Lund Server 1 is a member of the Clonable Domain Controllers group. That's really all that needs to be done. You can also do that in the Active Directory Admin Center if you'd like. We're going to open up an administrative PowerShell window. Okay, and here we're going to check our application compatibility. So get ADDC cloning, and you're going to want to hit tab. Get ADDC cloning excluded application list. What a commandlet. Thank you very much for tab completion, because that makes it a lot faster to do that. All right, what this does is it actually lists out the programs that are installed, which I only have one, but it would list out the programs and the services, okay? The idea here is that we would then go in and identify if anything needed to be excluded. If it did, then we would have to take the steps to actually exclude those applications from being cloned. So that kind of leads us to an important point. I mean, first of all, your Active Directory domain controllers aren't really supposed to have a whole lot of other stuff going on. At most, you're thinking DNS, maybe DHCP and AD. You're not going to have web applications. You're not going to have line of business applications on DCs. It's not going to be your Exchange server, SharePoint, none of that. In fact, Microsoft doesn't recommend most of that, and they don't support some of it. You know, so it's not ever something that you want to do. Domain controllers are supposed to be exclusive, which kind of leads us back to this to say, well, this is probably not, you're probably not going to have to take very many steps, especially if I just create a new domain controller like I just did. It doesn't have anything else on it, and I just then want to clone it. The only exception here would be our web services, you know, that we would probably want to exclude or just remove, all right? So you're just trying to make sure that everything supports cloning. Once you've done that, we're going to go back to the same command, okay, get ADDC cloning excluded application list, and now we're going to generate an XML file. Okay, so it says the inclusion list was written to this location, custom DC clone allow list. You can then just go modify that file if you want. Now we create the ADDC cloning config file or clone config file. And there are some other things that you can specify here: clone computer names, IP addresses, default gateways, stuff like that. That can also all be configured after the fact. You can specify a certain path. Otherwise, it just does it locally. Okay. So it does some tests and make sure that you're passing all the tests. First thing is, you know, is the FSMA role holder 2012 or later. And then is the local domain controller member of the Clonable Domain Controllers group. And then it looks for that XML file. No excluded applications were detected. So it's passed all of the test, and it has created the DC clone config.xml file in the Windows NTDS directory. Your next step would be to shut down this system, okay? We would shut down the system. If I can actually click the shut down the system, that would be helpful. There we go. All right, so we tell it it's planned, hit continue, and shut it down. I'm going to switch over to a host machine. And so on this host computer, we're actually going to launch the Hyper-V Manager. And this is where we would then go to export that VM, okay? Now, we've got a little, you get some things going on here. There is support for nested virtualization in Server 2016, so you can have a virtual machine that has Hyper-V installed on it. For some reason, the online labs that we're using, their platforms haven't been upgraded. My guess is they're probably not using 2016 to host it yet, and they haven't upgraded everything. And so it won't let me actually complete this. We've done all the important stuff. So I'm just we'll kind of go through the motions here right now, but I just wanted to offer that little disclaimer. Funny thing is about that is that this online lab environment is hosted by Microsoft. So I find it humorous that we can't use nested virtualization yet. but it is what it is. All you would do at this point is you would right click the shutdown machine and you would export. Okay, so we would then choose a location that we wanted to export the files to. And then we would, once that was done, you would click Import Virtual Machine. And when you click Import Virtual Machine, we hit Next, we hit Browse, we go to that location. I don't think they've got, yeah, we go to the location where we had exported the files, and we would select the folder. It would read the VM. It would read the VM information from that exported directory and create a new VM using those imported files. We start the VM and we're off and running. Now it'll randomly name it unless I specified a name in the clone config file. It'll give it a dynamic IP address and gateway, but it will be a domain controller for that domain. So when you run that new ADDC clone config file command, if you want to be particular, IP addresses, names, that kind of thing, then you can do that then. Otherwise, we can just go change that after the fact. We're still able to rapidly deploy a domain controller in a matter of minutes. Really, the longest period of time that it takes is the actual export process on the domain controller. So that's a great new feature. It was first introduced in 2012. It's very relevant in the environments that we're talking about, because how it can rapidly deploy additional domain controllers to serve our needs. Okay, so we looked at the installation as you would on either a VM or a physical machine, the desktop experience or server core, and then we also talked about the capabilities of cloning virtualized domain controllers.